G'day guys, Will here, and I'm hiding behind a massive box here because this is a huge graphics card. So as you can see in front of me here, I have a brand new AORUS Xtreme GeForce RTX 2080 Ti graphics card. And I'm gonna lay the box down quickly now so it's not blocking the entire view here. But we also have a EK Vector Aorus RTX 2080 Ti RGB Water Block as well from EK to install onto this graphics card. Now, before we get stuck into this video, just want to quickly address a couple of things. First of all, as you'll see, this is one of the first videos that we've shot in our brand new studio, which I'm really excited about. Now, I am aware that there is still a little bit of echo going on in this. Okay, well, there's actually quite a lot of echo still going on in the room. I do have some acoustic treatment on its way to the studio right now to install over the next, hopefully, 3 or 4 days. So in the future, there'll be a lot less echo, but for the next couple of videos, you might just have to bear with me for that. So apologies for that. Now, secondly, I also do want to state right from the onset here that I did pay absolutely full retail for all of the products that you see in this video. Nothing was sponsored, nothing was provided for free. There were no discounts or anything like that. That said, if you are interested in purchasing any of the products that you do see in this video, I have some Amazon affiliate links in the description below, which you can use. And a little portion of that, percentage of that goes back into helping out with the channel, building things like this studio, buying more gear to review for you guys. So thank you very much for all the support. But anyway, let's get stuck into it. And I'll start off by just explaining the reasons why I've chosen this card specifically. Because as you guys that have seen my previous videos would know, I've always kind of been an ASUS guy. I've always kind of used ASUS products in most of my PCs. And I've kind of broken away from that with this one. Now, I did a lot of research. Obviously, this is going into my current PC, which I'm using for sim racing, video editing, and all those sorts of things. I'm ultimately going to be building another system to drive the sim specifically. But in the meantime, I'm going to be putting this into my existing system, running that. And then in a couple of months' time, basically, once we see how the 3950X goes from AMD, I'm going to build another system. So there were 3 main reasons why I chose this card specifically. The first being that it is a factory overclocked card. So the reference cards run at 1545 megahertz from factory, whereas this card runs at 1770 megahertz. So it's a pretty decent overclock from factory. Now, I know a lot of you might be thinking, why would you pay extra for a factory overclock card when you can just overclock it yourself? Now, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that here, but basically, what happens is these factory overclock cards are using higher binned chips. Now, binning is basically the process of selecting higher quality chips to use in cards that are going to be running higher clock frequencies. So that means that lower quality chips can go into reference cards that are running the lower clock frequency, and the higher quality chips can go into overclock cards. So theoretically, what that means is that we should be able to get some really decent overclocking results on top of the 1770 megahertz that we have from factory. Now, we're not going to be overclocking at all in this video. We'll be testing all that sort of stuff out a little bit later on. What we are going to be focusing on in this video is getting it unboxed, getting the water block installed, and getting it installed into my PC. Now, the other 2 reasons why I chose this card specifically were that it has all the outputs that I needed. So I wanted to have 3 DisplayPort outputs for my triple monitor setup, as well as an HDMI output so that I could run another screen. So I run up to 4 monitors simultaneously, but you do have that multi-configuration output, which was a really big selling point for me because it gave me exactly what I needed. The other reason as well was that there was an EK water block that was available for this card. And I really love the EK products. I've always been a big fan of theirs. Really nice looking, really good quality, nice and easy to install and no problems. So without further ado, let's get this unboxed. Let's show you what you get inside the package, get the water block installed, and get it installed into the PC. All right, so let's have a look at what we get inside the box here. So as soon as you open up, you're presented with a little black envelope which has a bunch of different little bits and pieces in it. We'll have a quick look over those now. So you get a little ASUS Care booklet, which has got a little bit of information there. Your driver disc, of course, which has the overclocking utility as well. And a little leaflet here explaining the various different video output modes. So as I mentioned earlier, I bought this card. One of the big reasons I bought this card is because I wanted to use 3 display ports as well as HDMI port. So we lift up the next cover here and we've got a little bracket here, which is a really useful addition. This card does weigh a lot. So this is a little stand that you can implement into your case to sort of support the weight of the card. So anyway, let's take a look at the card itself. So a triple fan configuration here, and we're not too worried about that because we're going to be replacing it with a water block anyway, but I do imagine that this would perform quite well even if you're just running it stock with the air cooler on it as well, but obviously we're going to be implementing it into my water cooled case today. But we've got a nice little back panel here as well with RGB lighting inside the AORUS logo that you can see there. And yeah, overall, it looks like a pretty solid product. You can see the various different outputs are labeled here. We've got our 3 display ports, USB-C, HDMI port, as well as 2 additional HDMI ports as well that you can run in that configuration. Now, popping it on the scales, you can see it does weigh a hefty 1.4 kilograms. But anyway, let's get to installing the water block. So you're gonna need a set of jeweler's screwdrivers here. You're gonna want something to clean up your thermal compound as well. So I'm using Thermaltake's Purifier and Surface Prepper. Some little cotton tips that you can use to clean the die as well. Anything non-abrasive should be okay. I also like to have a little square of paper towel here as well, just to wipe up the mess. So you can see the water block here, really nice looking piece of kit, and let's get it installed. So first of all, pull the card out of its static wrapping. It's always a good idea to keep the card inside its static wrap if you're not using it, and undo all the screws that you can see accessible from the back plate. We want to make sure we undo the heatsink screws, which are the 4 larger holes in a cross pattern. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, there are a couple of additional screws that are actually securing the fan assembly in place that don't go through the backplate, so you'll need to release those as well. On this particular card, there were 3 of them, but just check over the card, make sure that there's nothing that's gonna snag there, and then you can lift off the cooler. Now, it does take a little bit of force to kind of release it from the thermal pads and the thermal goop, and make sure you sort of fold it over towards the side as you can see me doing here, because there are some fan and lighting connections that you'll need to release before you can just take it off. So very delicately get your hand in there, just kind of pull the connections out. They'll release with relative ease, and then you can remove the cooler entirely. So next we're going to want to prep this card for installing the water block. So we start off by removing all the thermal pads. They should come off pretty cleanly. Easier if it's a brand new card like this one is. If it's had a few heat cycles, you might have a little bit more trouble getting these off, but you can clean them away with thermal prepper. Just try to leave as minimal mess as possible on the various different chips on the board. And then we want to undo the remaining screws to release the back plate. So again, the back plate can take a little bit of force to release from those thermal pads. And again, we do have an RGB lighting connection. So just be very careful, peel it off towards the side again, release that connection, and now you are left with the naked board. So remove any remaining thermal pads. Now, having a quick look at the PCB itself, you can see we've got 16 separate channels here, so 16 phases. But then having a look at the actual power controller chip, which I'm pointing out here, it's actually only an 8-phase controller. So what they're basically doing is pairing the phases. So we've got 8 paired phases in total. So what we want to do now is apply some of our thermal cleaner to the die itself. Let that soak in for a minute or so, and what will happen is it'll kind of loosen the stickiness of the thermal paste and make it very, very easy to remove. It kind of dilutes it, and then you can just clean it off with some cotton tips and some paper towel. Now, there are some little surface mount components there next to the die. You want to be very careful when you're cleaning around those that you don't scrape them off. It is difficult to break them, but you do need to be a little bit careful. So just slowly clean the surface here right to a mirror finish, and then we need to move on to cleaning all the other surfaces. So the RAM chips, the VRM chips, the chokes, and any other components that the heatsink is going to make contact with. So just take your time with this. It's obviously very important to make sure you get these as clean as you possibly can. Don't want any leftover residue, any dust or anything like that. So take your time, do the job right. Remember, it's only something you're ever gonna have to do once, so it's worth taking the time now. Next up, we want to put a couple of drops of our surface prepper, and this really gives us that beautiful mirror finish. It completely dissolves away. You can use rubbing alcohol to do this as well. This stuff just does a slightly better job with absolutely no residue left over at all. So rub it into the surface, get it to an absolute mirror finish, and then we can start installing our thermal pads. So follow the instructions here. EK's instruction sheet gives you very clear instructions. You will need to cut some of these to get them to exactly the right shape. Basically, stick them down on the various different components as labeled. Take your time with this again, because there's only just about the right amount of thermal pad that you get with you, and try to make sure your hands are really clean before doing this as well. You don't want to end up with oily residue. Try to minimize the amount of contact that you're actually making with the thermal surfaces. You don't want to get any greasy fingerprints or anything like that on these. So just take your time, do the job right again, remembering that this is something you're only going to have to do once, so it's worth taking the time to do it correctly from the start. It's also very important to make sure that you don't block any of the screw holes that are in close proximity here as well. You just really need to make sure you trim these strips so they're exactly the right length, so they're not going to block anything, or also poke out of the side of the card as well, because the front of the EK water block is actually transparent on the sides of the actual channels itself. You can actually see some of these strips through the side if you don't cut them the exact right length. So just make sure you get this as tidy as you possibly can. Now, when you think you're finished, it's a good idea to just cross-reference the chart once more, just to make sure you haven't missed anything. There are a lot of little tiny components there. You want to make absolutely sure none of them are going to overheat. So once you're finished, tidy up your workspace, because we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so now it's time to unpackage the beautiful water block from EK. Set it up on top of the box as well. You'll understand the reason for this a little bit later on. Set it to the side. We need to do our final preparation of the card now before installing it on the water block. And so we start off by doing our surface purifier once more, just to make sure there's no dust or any remaining residue. Make sure it's absolutely mirror finish clean, and then remove the blue coatings from all of our thermal strips. Again, being very, very careful here not to get any fingerprints or any dirt or dust on them. Obviously, you want to work in as clean an area as possible to minimize the risk here. Now, once you're happy that the surface is prepared, you can go ahead and install your thermal compound. Now, the instructions here were a little bit unclear, because the text actually says to do a cross pattern, which is what I'm used to doing for graphics cards, but the image actually shows putting a pea-sized dot in the middle. Now, because we've got a large void area around the outside of the die itself, I feel like with graphics cards in particular, more is usually a better option. It doesn't really matter if you put too much paste on, but if you put too little, it's going to be a big problem. So better to put a little bit too much than a little bit too little. But we want to line up the card here and basically drop it down on top of the heatsink. Easier to do this from behind than putting the heatsink onto the card, because the screws are going to go in from the back. So you can see here why it's important to have this sitting up on top of the box, so the edge of the card can sit down flat. And then we basically want to go through, make sure all of our cables are as lined up as possible. So once you're happy that all the screws are lined up, we can begin installing. So we want to make sure we put a little plastic washer underneath each screw and go in a cross pattern, starting with the ones around the GPU core. So diagonally across, put them all in place, finger tighten them first, and then tighten them down diagonally one at a time. So you're going 1, 2, 3, 4 in a diagonal pattern. And again, making sure that we have a washer underneath each one. That's very, very important. Now, for the remaining screws, we want to make sure that we're not blocking the screws that are going to ultimately go through the backplate as well. So we want to sort of check the instructions, make sure we're only installing the screws that we need to, that aren't going to be going through the backplate. Again, it's very, very clear when you look at the instructions, so no need to go into a massive amount of detail here. We're wanting to use the shorter screws that come with the kit. And next, we need to install the thermal strips on our backplate. Now, I found that there was a little bit of CNC machining residue on mine, so just make sure that it's absolutely clean before you install it. The last thing you want to have is any little metal filings that end up inside your graphics card shorting something out. So I used, again, some purifier and surface prepper just to clean the back of the card, make sure it was absolutely perfectly clean before I installed these thermal strips. Again, following the instructions, they're very, very clear from EK, which is great. Take your time, do it once and do it right. So once you're happy that everything's clean and tidy, you can install the backplate. Now, we don't want to install washers underneath this backplate. It's simply backplate directly to the card and then put the screws in place. No washers whatsoever. And we're wanting to use the longer screws here as well. I did check this with EK beforehand, because I've seen a few other videos where people were using washers. And you can see here how I've routed the RGB cable, so it's sitting between the PCB and the channel there, so it can't short out. So we're almost at the finish line now. We just need to install our blanking plates for our water channels. and flip it around and install our fittings as well. Okay, so time to get it installed into the system. So obviously being a hardline water-cooled system, this is a little bit more tricky than it would be in your conventional system or even a system with soft tubing. So we start off by draining it. Now we don't need to get all the water out of it, but you'll find that when you drain a system, most of the water actually pulls through in a vacuum anyway. So you can see here, it's kind of running through the channels. It's actually pretty cool how this works. It kind of, the air moving out kind of sucks the water out with it. So you will need to sort of tip and tilt the case a little bit to get all the rest of the water out. Just basically want to make sure that there's no water in the top radiator or any of the pipes that you're going to be disconnecting here. So put some paper towel down, release the fittings, making sure we also release the other side as well so we're not twisting any O-rings or anything like that. Pop the connections out, and what I like to do is clean it out with a little bit of paper towel as well, just to remove any coolant residue that might be sitting in the fittings. So if you do have any pipes like I do that are running up from a higher level, it's a good idea to block them up with some blue tack or something like that, just so there's no chance of any additional liquid running down when you move the case around or anything like that. So next we just need to disconnect everything, pull the card out, and get the new one installed. So I just basically tipped the remaining coolant out into the sink, flushed it down, made sure that the card was flushed out as well so there was no residue left behind. Pull the card out of the housing. You can see here, the layout is very, very similar between the 1080 Ti and the 2080 Ti, which is going to make installation very, very simple. So popping the new card into our vertical GPU mount. And now the moment of truth. Now I've got a very, very, very tight tolerance between my RAM and my my reservoir here. So it's a very, very tight fit, and I was quite concerned that it might not even fit in there at all, but we ended up with less than 1 millimeter on either side. Everything went in perfectly fine though, which is the main thing. So get everything secured back down again. Now to lubricate the pipes before we reinstall them, I like to mix up some warm soapy water. Just dishwashing detergent or anything like that is fine. Just put some on your finger and kind of run it around the fitting itself as well as the pipe and the O-ring, and that helps it to slot back in nice and cleanly without making any tears or anything like that. So wipe it around, make sure it all installs nice and cleanly again. You should feel a nice firm sort of clunk as it fits in if everything's done correctly. Make sure all your other fittings are nice and tight as well, that nothing's moved around while you've been working. Plug everything else back in, put down some paper towel, and now we can start refilling the system. Now, because I've got this weird sort of U-bend that's going up and then down, I actually need to tilt my case on the side to get the water to run through initially. Once the pump's running, there's no problem whatsoever. It kind of just follows through the loop. But to initially bleed the system, I do need to sort of tilt it and twist it around a little bit just to get things going. So once we've got water in as much of the case as possible, we're going to remove the reservoir cap once more so we can actually pull air through. Just makes bleeding a lot more simple and straightforward. And then switch on our water pump. And we should see the water begin to flow. So when the reservoir empties, always make sure you stop and refill. Very important. And there we have it. Now, one thing that I do want to mention here is that I do actually have the flow path backwards in this graphics card. Now, it only makes a couple of degrees difference, so it's not a major issue, but when I do build my final system for this 2080 Ti, I will be reversing the flow. You can see on the middle of the card there, you've got sort of what's called a jet plate, which actually pushes the water out through the center of the die and then out towards the sides. So it just means that the coolest water is hitting those channels first, which makes a tiny little bit of difference, but every little bit matters. But you know, for the case of this, I'm only going to be running this card in this machine temporarily, and that's it. Okay guys, so I'm absolutely over the moon with how this has come up. It looks absolutely fantastic inside the case. No problems with the installation whatsoever. All the pipes were even in exactly the same place for the inlets and outlets as they were on my 1080 Ti as well. So that made installation very simple. As you could see while I was installing it, there is a very finite amount of space there between the back of the RAM and the back of the front of the RAM and the back of the reservoir. Only about 1 millimeter on either side. So I was really lucky that it slotted in there perfectly. Now, of course, looks aren't the primary reason why somebody would go and spend this amount of money on a graphics card. So we also need to have a quick look at performance. Now, bear in mind that I haven't overclocked this card yet. I'm going to quickly compare it to the 1080 Ti that I had previously, which was overclocked to about 2 gigahertz. I'm going to do a quick comparison in F1 2018 so you can see the difference in frame rate. Bearing in mind I have the graphics settings exactly the same in both. I'm not streaming or anything like that. We will look at streaming and the performance increases there in more detail later on, as well as, of course, overclocking. But for now, I just want to quickly run you through the pre and post results in F1 2018. So I really don't need to say a whole lot here. You can see for yourself the massive increase in frame rate there, which means I'm going to be able to run much higher graphics settings and hopefully run much higher quality streaming as well without all the glitches and problems that I've had in the past. So really excited to get this all fired up and do some more testing. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, I do have some Amazon affiliate links where you can pick up this gear for yourself, and I do really appreciate it when you guys use those links because it does make all of this kind of stuff possible. So hit the thumbs up button if you've enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe and the notification bell as well so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.